Welcome to today's program, Bitcoin and Cryptocurrency, Law and Tax. All right, as we jump into today's seminar, just an overview of the agenda items that we'll look at. I'm going to walk through initially a little bit of background of cryptocurrencies and blockchain, explain how those work, what makes them unique versus other types of currency and assets, what makes them unique from a technology standpoint, and try to give you a flavor of why the technology is so revolutionary. After we do some background on cryptocurrencies, we'll talk a little bit about law and regulation. Brian will focus primarily on the tax components, and we'll hit some other regulatory items as well. And if we have time towards the end, we'll talk about some unique cases dealing with Bitcoin and blockchain. All right, so the first thing to understand is when we talk about Bitcoin, Bitcoin is one of several cryptocurrencies. And cryptocurrencies are, generally speaking, digital assets or money. They're designed to be secure so that they can be transmitted electronically through secure mechanisms, not subject to manipulation or hacking. And in some cases, oftentimes, in fact, cryptocurrency transactions can be done anonymously or what we call pseudonymously, which means that there's some degree of anonymity to the transaction. Bitcoin is well known because it's one of the first, if not the first, cryptocurrency, certainly the first one to gain mainstream acceptance and use. And the Bitcoin blockchain is the first major blockchain to, again, reach national attention and worldwide attention, and one that has been used regularly going back to the formation of Bitcoin, which I think dates back to about 2008. When we talk about blockchains, I'll talk about those in a few minutes, but Bitcoin operates on a blockchain. There are several other blockchains. Each cryptocurrency operates on its own blockchain, and the blockchain is just a ledger, and each one operates on its own blockchain. And blockchains can be used for other purposes besides the transaction of cryptocurrencies. And we may talk about that a little bit. You know, one big area that we're seeing a blockchain movement is in health records and other information and data that needs to be kept secure and be accessed by various parties in a secure environment. We're also going to touch on, besides the federal, or besides the tax issues, federal and state regulatory issues. And this gets interesting because under federal and state law and with interpretation from various courts and cases and agencies, we have different interpretations of what Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies actually are. Most notably, the U.S. Department of Treasury through its Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, otherwise known as FinCEN, previously issued guidance in the early days of Bitcoin, essentially stating that cryptocurrency businesses would be treated as money transmitters, thus suggesting that cryptocurrency would be treated as money or cash. It would therefore be subject to Bank Secrecy Act rules and Know Your Customer rules, and businesses operating in the cryptocurrency space that were moving a lot of cryptocurrency, such as exchanges, would be subject to money transmitter laws and regulations, and also have to be licensed potentially as money transmitters. Meanwhile, in 2014, the IRS came out with its initial guidance, and the IRS essentially took the position that Bitcoin was not cash but was property and would be taxed as property, and Brian will explain later what the implications of that are. All right, and then I'll make a note, there's a point on there about the VCBA, that's the Virtual Currency Businesses Act. That's a uniform law passed by the Uniform Laws Commission, or proposed by the Uniform Laws Commission a couple of years ago. It's been sent out to the states, and the purpose of the law is an attempt to create a uniform regulation around cryptocurrency businesses. So the first known cryptocurrency regulation at a state level was the New York Bit License. And in order to create some type of uniformity among states, the Uniform Laws Commission has proposed a Virtual Currency Businesses Act that would apply across states. All right, here, this next chart just shows you And this is actually a little bit outdated because it's a 2018 chart, but it shows you the market capitalization or the value of total cryptocurrencies, the top 10 cryptocurrencies at the time. This has changed a little bit. I pulled some numbers as of late 2019, just within the last 2 or 3 months. Bitcoin, of course, is still at the top, and the market value of Bitcoin as of November 2019 was almost 150 billion. Ethereum was still in the number 2 spot, and XRP, which is a Ripple cryptocurrency, was still in the number 3 spot. It's not so much to give you individual data on each of these cryptocurrencies, but just to let you know how large the market is worldwide for these for the product or for the currencies. All right, so as I noted earlier, Bitcoin operates on what is known as the blockchain. And the blockchain in and of itself is a revolutionary mechanism. It is essentially it's a database. It's a database ledger. Similar to a bank or an accounting department might keep a ledger. Blockchain is a ledger of all Bitcoin transactions. The difference with blockchain is that it's a distributed or decentralized ledger that operates in a world where anybody can access it by going on the internet and going to whichever particular blockchain you want to look at. The Bitcoin blockchain can be accessed at blockchain.info, and you can see all transactions that are occurring in almost real time when you go look at it. The blockchain is what enables the cryptocurrencies to be transmitted among anonymous or semi-anonymous users. It tracks all cryptocurrency transactions, and the largest blockchain essentially is the Bitcoin blockchain, and that serves as, again, it's a publicly viewable ledger for all Bitcoin transactions. I put a note in here, though, that you should be aware that the blockchains do not have to be public. Private individuals or private entities can create blockchains, private associations. There's been talk of semi-private or what are also called permissioned blockchains being used by financial institutions, by insurance companies. Again, if they were used for health records, they wouldn't be public blockchains. So you can create a blockchain and use that as a ledger for tracking not only currency transactions, but other access and movement of data. All right, so this next slide talks about what the unique features are of Bitcoin, and not only Bitcoin, but any cryptocurrency that operates on a blockchain similar to the Bitcoin blockchain. First, as I noted in the last slide, blockchains are decentralized and distributed. So there's no headquarters, as I put in parentheses here. There's no central location where the Bitcoin blockchain is located. You can't go somewhere and see somebody updating transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain. Instead, the blockchain, anybody can go online, and in the early days, a lot of people did this, and this is how miners, and we'll talk about that a little bit further on the slide, but miners initially got their start by downloading the software and essentially participating in updating transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain. So rather than this ledger being located in one location, it's on the internet, it's distributed. Any computer can go and access the blockchain, and when transactions happen, what it looks like is data reflecting transactions and the transfer of Bitcoin or any other type of transaction, and that data is all put into one particular block, and that block is connected to a previous block through cryptographic hash functions. And the security lies in the technology with those cryptographic hash functions. And essentially, in layman's terms, the way it works is that once a block is ready to be added to the blockchain, a mathematical function is sent out from the Bitcoin network. And it goes to anybody who's chosen to participate as a miner and has downloaded the software and wants to access the blockchain. And when that cryptographic hash function goes out, essentially it's a complicated math function, and the first party or the first computer system to verify and get the correct answer of the cryptographic hash essentially wins that round of hash functioning, and the answer is sent out to the entire network. And then everybody else that's participating in the network verifies that the answer is correct or the answer is not correct. And once the answer is verified as correct, that next chain gets added to the previous block on the blockchain, hence the name blockchain. So the analogy that I like to use is if you think about square root functions. If I ask somebody to square, what's the square of 526, you might be able to figure that out pretty quickly without a calculator and very quickly with a calculator. But if I ask you to create the, by hand without a calculator to come up with the square root of 524,000, that's going to take you a little bit of time to come up with that square root. But once somebody gets the answer, it's very easy to verify. You simply have to take the square root, square it, and see if the answer is correct. That's a similar analogy to how the cryptographic hashing works on the blockchain. It's a very complicated math procedure that goes out, but once there's an answer, it's very easy for everybody else to verify that the answer is correct. And data doesn't get added to the blockchain until that cryptographic function returns is correct. So that's a secure feature, and once data is added to the blockchain, it can't be removed. So there's security, again, via cryptography. It's through a decentralized system. There's no intermediaries. There's no there's no central headquarters. There's no president of Bitcoin or president of blockchain that's sitting in a room and can verify the transactions are correct, or nobody is required to be involved to ensure the transactions are correct. This all just occurs through computers mathematically. There's nobody to call if you think there's an error, or if you want to unwind or reverse a transaction, or if you've lost your wallet key, which we'll talk about in a few moments. So it's that absence of intermediaries that really that adds to the revolutionary nature of the technology. Again, transactions are irreversible or immutable. This again adds to the security. If you want to unwind a Bitcoin transaction or a blockchain transaction, the only way to do that is to add another transaction to another block that essentially is the reverse of the transaction you're trying to eliminate. So it won't erase the data. Instead, you'll have a transaction and you'll have a reversal of that transaction. Cryptocurrencies are exchangeable typically. In fact, some of them are more difficult to acquire than others, and so if you have Bitcoin or Ethereum or Ether, which is the coin of Ethereum, or some of the other more popular ones, you can sometimes use those to exchange for other cryptocurrencies. Pseudonymous, and this again will become clearer in another couple slides when I talk about how wallets work with cryptocurrencies. Essentially, what this refers to is the fact that you can engage in a cryptocurrency transaction, a Bitcoin transaction, without giving up your personal information. Now, you can give up your personal information. There's several companies that I know in the past have taken Bitcoin for payment, and some that still do. At one point, I don't know if they still do, there were certain charities that had their Bitcoin address on their website so that you could donate and give Bitcoin to the charity. So you can make your address for people to send you Bitcoin public, but when somebody sends you the Bitcoin, all the blockchain is going to show is the numerical address of the person who sent. It's only going to show two numerical addresses, one of the recipient and one of the sender. And when you receive the Bitcoin payment, you're only going to see the receipt of the payment through the numerical representation. You're not going to see who actually sent it. This is why you see Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, most notably, and most often Bitcoin being used for things like cyber ransom. If somebody is locking up your data and demanding payment, they don't want to tell you, well, mail me a check to this address, because that's going to give away where they are. They don't want to tell you to deposit money into a certain bank account, again, because that could potentially give away who they are. But if they tell you send a certain amount of Bitcoin to this address, all they have to do is just give you a string of characters, and you have to send the money to that string of characters if you want to comply with their demands. And there's no way really, no reasonable way for the average person to figure out who they're sending that to. There are some more complicated mechanisms that have been used to actually track Bitcoin transactions, and there's some countermeasures to that. Again, we'll talk about a little bit of that if we have time as we go on. So the transactions can be anonymous or semi-anonymous. And proponents of Bitcoin will say that Bitcoin is truly a fair currency because there's no manipulation of the market value. You don't have governments or other entities that are pumping extra Bitcoin into the system or doing things to affect the value of Bitcoin. In fact, the way Bitcoin is set up when it was originally created, the way the program is set up is it will essentially release a certain amount of Bitcoin gets released into the Bitcoin universe on a steady pace according simply to mathematical functions in time. And that was written in the program by whoever the author was initially, Satoshi Nakamoto or whoever you think that may be. And that was an original part of the original creation of Bitcoin. So some would argue that that makes Bitcoin a more fair store of value or mechanism of value because you always know exactly how much Bitcoin is out in the universe and how much more Bitcoin is going to be in the universe, and that's a limited amount. I should also add that you don't have to transact or buy or sell Bitcoin in whole amounts, so you can break it down up to 1/8 of a decimal point, and or up to 8 decimal points, pardon me. And I encourage people, if you've never done anything with any cryptocurrencies, especially if you have clients who do, or if you want to get more familiar with it for the professionals out there, lawyers and accountants who may have avoided this, go buy 0.00001 out to 8 decimal points. Buy the smallest amount of Bitcoin that you can buy. It'll cost you less than $100. Set up a couple wallets. I'll show you how to do that generally, and then move it around. And once you do that, it'll become more familiar to you. The miners, I mentioned the miners earlier. Here's the function of the miners. There's essentially two functions in the Bitcoin universe. The miners get their name because by participating in the Bitcoin blockchain, miners have an opportunity to win Bitcoin. Whoever is that one computer or controls that one computer that solves the initial cryptographic function, it goes out to be verified by everybody. If you're the party that solves that, you get Bitcoin. And this is part of how Bitcoin value is controlled. In early Bitcoin days, you might have gotten several hundred Bitcoin for solving a puzzle. Then that number drops down and it will keep halving. And so a couple of years ago, you would get 25 Bitcoin for solving the puzzle, and then you got 12.5 Bitcoin. And depending on time and the amount of transactions, that number will continue to shrink until all of the Bitcoin in the Bitcoin universe are distributed. And once that's done, that's it. There'll be no more Bitcoin. Why do miners participate? They participate to try and get Bitcoin dollars. But what's the other function of the miners? Well, the miners are necessary to verify the transactions. Without the miners, there's nobody to verify that the secure data in the block and the block is true and correct, so that information can be attached to the blockchain. Now, in other systems, you don't necessarily have the same payout to miners. And the question also comes up, well, what happens once all the Bitcoin that's going to be distributed gets distributed into the Bitcoin universe? Will miners continue to participate? And the answer is that in other blockchains and in the Bitcoin blockchain, what theoretically will happen and what happens in some circumstances is you may want to, there may be a backup in the system where you can't get your transaction processed right away, and you'll have to pay essentially a fee, a token fee or a commission. It'll be a portion of your transaction will be a transaction fee that will operate to substitute for the payment that the miners receive from the Bitcoin network. So at some point, that payment will have to come from private parties. That has interesting implications because one of the benefits of Bitcoin is that there's no intermediaries and then thus no payment. So like with a credit card system or bank system, you don't have to pay somebody else. But in reality, you'll end up paying anyway to transact business. And a lot of people acquire Bitcoins through exchanges, so they end up paying anyway. And then finally, the last point, obviously, because this exists electronically and on the internet, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are borderless and international, except, of course, to the extent that foreign governments try to shut them down in certain jurisdictions with some or little success. And one thing that didn't come up on the last, and I want to make sure we leave enough time for other stuff we need to cover. That was a lot of information, I know. But what also makes Bitcoin unique, this blockchain function, what this did that was revolutionary was it took transferring. Normally, if you wanted to try and transfer digital money, you transfer a file from you and you transfer it to somebody else, and you have the double spend problem. So you'll hear this term, the double spend problem. You'll also hear it referred to more amorphously as the Byzantine generals problem. The issue is with normal transactions, and you can read about this with the old Napster case with the first use doctrine and copyright. When you transfer a file to somebody else, it's not the same thing as giving $1 to somebody else, or giving a record album to somebody else, or giving something to somebody else. The reason for that is that file still exists on your system, so now you have both people who can spend the money. You've got to trust that the other person is not going to spend that coin anymore. And this decentralized blockchain that controls Bitcoin essentially solved that problem. That's what makes this technology really revolutionary from a monetary standpoint. Now, talk a minute about wallets, keys, and addresses. As I noted earlier, if you want to move Bitcoin, you send Bitcoin from your wallet, which is stored according to a key, which is just a string of characters, to another string of characters, and that's how it's reflected on the Bitcoin blockchain. The public key is your address. That's what you could put on your website for, tell anybody, pay me here, and you can make that anonymous. Or if you're a business that wants to accept Bitcoin, you can put that on your website or somewhere else and just tell everybody that address. The private key is the second key that you use, and when you go to transact Bitcoin, or when you go to send somebody Bitcoin, the system is going to ask you for your private key, and that's a second string of numbers. And I have this in a couple slides, so you'll get to see an example. But I want to note that there's several ways that you can hold cryptocurrencies. You can do it through a desktop or computer file, which is not recommended. There's stories of people who have had Bitcoin data stored on their computer. They leave the computer on an airplane, leave it on the seat of the car, and it gets stolen. Spill coffee on it. Something happens to that. That Bitcoin that's stored there, if you have no other way to access the Bitcoin, they are gone forever. Again, there's no headquarters, there's no 1-800 number to call and get that back. A lot of folks for large amounts of Bitcoin recommend cold storage, which is similar to a secure and encrypted zip drive that you would keep your Bitcoin data on. You put it on some type of secure zip drive that you can disconnect from the network, toss that into a safe or a safe deposit box, and that's considered a pretty secure way to hold Bitcoin, especially in large amounts. There's web and cloud wallets that you can use. There's several. If you go in the App Store, either for Android or Apple, you'll see all types of wallets that you can use to hold various cryptocurrencies. That's another way to do it. But again, subject to, if you lose your phone and the wallet's only on your phone, you have a problem. If it's on the cloud, it's connected. Anything in the internet is subject to a hack or to some type of cybersecurity issue. That's the case with web and cloud, mobile devices and apps. And then you have paper and brain wallets. A paper wallet is just like what it sounds. It's all the information, your data that you use to transact Bitcoin is all printed out on a piece of paper that you can then put in a safe deposit box. You can carry it in your wallet, however else you want to do it, or you can memorize the information. And if you memorize it, then it's in your head. As long as nothing happens to you, then your information is secure. You can acquire cryptocurrencies. The most common now really is through exchanges, Coinbase and other exchanges, although it's not recommended that you keep large amounts there. Contrary to popular misconception, the Bitcoin network as a blockchain has never been hacked. Cybersecurity professionals have acknowledged that it's a very secure network, but exchanges have been hacked. Mt. Gox is the most notable, but there's other exchanges that have been hacked and have had security issues, so it's not recommended that you keep large amounts of any cryptocurrency on an exchange. There are also peer-to-peer offerings and websites where you can go and you can exchange currencies. There's websites that exist to exchange Bitcoin and other currencies for different types of currencies. And then you have initial coin offerings, which were popular a couple of years ago. What I'll note about initial coin offerings is to be careful because one, you're dealing with, oftentimes it's going to be a new cryptocurrency, so it sounds a lot like an IPO, except it's an ICO. The other problem there with sounding a lot like an IPO is the SEC also thinks it sounds like a lot like an IPO, so you're potentially subject to SEC regulation with respect to any initial coin offerings, and there's a test for that. It's the Howey test. We may have time to talk about that as we go forward. Next slide, please. All right, so this and the next one are charts, and this is just an overview of how you would transact Bitcoin. First, as I noted earlier, you download the software. You can do it on a phone, computer, or tablet, and once you have the software, you create your own unique address to transact Bitcoin. And then if you want to, let's say you're selling a boat, and you want to sell your boat, and somebody's going to pay you in Bitcoin, then you give them the address. And there you see it's a string of characters. I think I said numbers earlier, but it's characters. It's numbers and letters. And you have that string. You give that string of characters to whoever's going to pay you, and they then go tell the Bitcoin network to pay that particular address. That person will then be asked to put in their private key, and then once the private key is entered, the information goes into the Bitcoin blockchain. It's in the block, and once that block is sealed up, verified through the cryptographic hash, accepted by the Bitcoin mining community, and added to the blockchain, that transaction is done. It is irreversible. If you decide you want to do a chargeback, like on a credit card, it's not happening unless you can get the other party to agree to send you back the money. And the next slide here shows an example of what a paper wallet looks like. And so you can see from wallet 1 and wallet 2, these are two different wallets. And if I wanted to send money from wallet 1 to wallet 2, I would take the string of characters and enter that's on the left side of wallet 1, or I could enter the QPC code, and just by showing that to my phone or whatever other camera mechanism I had, it'll automatically populate that data, and that's where I'm sending the information. Then the next step, when I want to send information to one address, if I'm sending it, for instance, to wallet 1, I'd be sending it from wallet 2 to wallet 1. I would enter the wallet 1 information on the top left, and then I'd be asked to verify that I want to send the amount and enter my private key, and that's the information on the right side. So that comes from the bottom right. That information, again, it's another string of characters that could be populated through the code, and you put that into the whatever mechanism you're using to send money. You can do it sometimes through wallets directly or through some other type of website or app, and you're able to send whatever amount of Bitcoin you specify to the other wallet. So that gives you a practical example of what that looks like. And obviously, if you store this just on a paper wallet like this, you can take that, you can stick it in your pocket, hand it to somebody, put it in a bank safe deposit box or somewhere else, and keep that information until you need to use it. I've even heard stories of people apparently putting large Bitcoin data in underground mines in South America.
I've heard that, yes. I've also heard of individuals that have stored it in their brain and they've died. So no one can access it after their death because they didn't leave any type of trail for their heirs to find it.
How disappointing. That's another point. Don't forget about Bitcoin when it comes time to do your estate planning and your asset protection. Okay, next slide.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
This is the exciting part. This is the tax part you've all been waiting for. So you understand now the basics of cryptocurrency and how it all operates, but the practicality of it is, let's say you have it or you're going to receive it as payment. What happens? We've discussed before about how FinCEN originally, for the purposes of regulation, said that it was currency. That was in 2013, but in 2014, the IRS issued a notice, and that's Notice 2014-21, that basically designated all cryptocurrencies as like property and not currency. And this is important because property, unlike cash or currency, every time you do a transaction, the exchange of property is taxable every single time it's exchanged. So under IRC 1001, if you accept Bitcoin for anything, be it goods, services, the fair market value of that good or service is what the amount realized is for the person who actually owns the Bitcoin. So they acquired it at a point, usually by purchase. That would be their basis. And then the amount of the fair market value of the good or service that was exchanged, that would be the amount realized. So you would subtract, you had the amount realized and you would subtract the basis, and then you would have a gain or loss. The taxpayer who pays with it has to report that to the IRS. Meanwhile, the person that accepts it has to account for the basis, its income. So they would have to, include in their own taxable a return what that income was, and then they would have a basis now on the Bitcoin. So then when they exchange it later, the same process would take place. What does this mean? The government has made it very cumbersome to utilize this technology as currency. That's basically what this has done. And that's what the law is. And it's important that not only do you have to know when you acquired your Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency as regards a holding period, because it's a capital asset, but you also need to know what the value was. If you can't substantiate your value for the IRS, it's going to be zero. Now, with tokens sales, as we discussed before, I mean, that's the idea being that when it's first offered, people can go to an exchange or however, and then they would buy it for USD currency. The actual purchase of cryptocurrency with US dollars is not taxable, at least for the person who buys it. The individual who offers it, depending on how it's structured, may or may not have a taxable transaction. But as for other things, every time that there's an exchange after that, it's taxable. And so, again, record keeping is very important as you advise your clients. If you can't substantiate how much you bought it for or acquired it for or how long you've held it, the IRS is going to say that you have no basis, which means the entire amount, the exchange, is going to be taxable. And the difference between a long-term and a short-term capital gain, one is at preferential rates, long-term, which is either 0, 15, or 20, depending on the tax bracket of the taxpayer, or ordinary income, which can be up, the marginal rate's 37%. So that's a big distinction between the two. As for the ICOs themselves, the Howey test really determines if the SEC is going to be, needs to be notified, and if all of the formalities of an initial public offering, pro formas, and all those things, and the rules behind that, does it apply or not? Now, there has been some recent activity to where the SEC has approved some ICOs where they're not regulated, but the facts are very specific. Turnkey is the main one. And it's basically, the idea is it's only used for in this one area. It has no value outside of its uses, which is an airline, and it's sort of like an arcade token. Only can be used there, and the value is fixed. Howey actually took place nearby us, a place called Howey in the Hills, and Eric can explain the
Howey
test.
involved orange groves or citrus groves, and the Northerners came down into Florida and were offered a chance to buy a small piece of Florida sunshine in the form of a citrus grove. And the idea was the sellers of those citrus groves would then harvest the citrus and ultimately generate profits. And those profits would be pooled and go out to all the owners. And it ended up being a case going to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the SEC said that sounds a lot like a securities investment. And this Supreme Court in the Howey and Hills case set out the elements of what a securities offering or securities transaction will look like. And those elements essentially are an investment in a common enterprise, such as orange groves or ICOs or something else, with an expectation of profits, where those profits are derived from someone else's efforts. Usually that person's called a promoter. And if you have those elements in a transaction, you're going to have a securities transaction. And I've had several folks come in, clients and prospective clients who want to do an ICO, and we start talking about what they want to do and the purpose of it, and it oftentimes sounds a lot like a securities offering. And if you fall into that, then you're going to be subject to SEC regulation and less subject to an exception.
Also, too, at the state level, depending on the state of where you're located, there might be blue sky laws that also apply for these types of things.
Right.
And so you have to be very careful with that. So not only is it a federal issue, but also be a state one as well. I believe the DAO case just confirmed that.
Yeah, that was the first major case by the SEC. So the DAO is the Distributed Autonomous Organization, and that was on the Ether network. And what happened with that was investors were given an opportunity to participate in this organization where all decisions would be made through voting done on the Ether network. It's just another blockchain similar to Bitcoin. And when the SEC looked at it, the SEC ran the Howey test and essentially made the determination that it was a securities environment.
Okay, just as an overview of compliance and income taxes, you have the main gist of it is that because it's considered property, every transaction except for a few exceptions are going to be taxable for the individual who is exchanging the Bitcoin, who held it to start with. The other is that the distinction between how for every other purpose the U.S. government looks at cryptocurrency as a form of currency. Yeah, as relates to criminal law, securities law, regulation as for the money transmitters, but for taxes, they look at it as property. And the distinction is big because sometimes a person can get whipsawed on both sides because of the way they've decided to look at it. And it's important because the government has made a conscious choice to do this on the tax side, at least, to encourage individuals not to utilize the technology for exchange. That's really what it boils down to. But it's interesting because you'll see as we go on, there are some cases that the result is not quite what you would think it would be based on how they have defined cryptocurrency.
Each court seems to have its own opinion.
Now, as for the taxation, how can a taxpayer account for basis? Well, because it's property, that basically the IRS looks at all cryptocurrencies as like real estate, basically, or a security. So the idea being that when it's acquired, you have to know how much you acquired it for and the time and the date you received it. That's important because when you dispose of it later, however you do it, that's how you're going to be taxed. That information, if you can't substantiate that, then it's going to be zero, and you're going to pay tax on the entire amount of the later on disposition, which is normally either an exchange or a sale for U.S. dollars. We know now under the new tax law in 2017, under IRC 1031A2, that cryptocurrency is not allowed to be involved in a like-kind exchange. Before there was some gray area on that, but for sure now we have confirmation in the tax code. It's in the actual statute. The only type of asset now that is allowed for like-kind exchange is only real estate now, which is a big change from before. Now, the other issue from a compliance standpoint is if you have a wallet and it's held offshore in an exchange, do all of the foreign asset rules apply to the taxpayer? Well, yes. If it meets the thresholds of value for FinCEN, you have FBARs each year, which is anything that's over $10,000. And then for FATCA, depending on if you're married or not and if you're overseas or not, but at a certain stage, be it 50,000, 100,000, and that's at any time during the course of the year, not just at the end of the year or before the year, but at any time if your account goes over that value, your exchange, your wallet, then you have to report it. Now, I'm not saying you have to pay tax on it, but there are reporting requirements, and if you fail to do so, the penalties are pretty bad for the taxpayer. So make sure you're aware of that. The other is if you're in the business or you own a lot of these, as relates to taxation, there are some special rules as relates to how you can account for gains and losses if it's considered a security or a commodity, things like washes and other things, to where it might be beneficial to the taxpayer who's exchanging these things, the market to market at times. However, it's unclear because of the way it's in one area, the federal government says that no, it's like a security, this is how it's going to be regulated, but the IRS says it's property. So we're unsure if these taxes, these tax breaks apply. My own personal opinion is probably not, but just need to be aware of that. Lastly, as relates to losses, is this a passive asset? Maybe. It's unclear, but the IRC 469 rules might apply to any losses. And then lastly, is it subject to probate? Well, yes, if an individual owns it in their individual name and they die and it's on a trust, that's great. It's subject to probate. It's subject to the estate tax. However, if you don't have the ability to access it, that's a problem, because a state court can't go to a bank and say, hey, hand this over. It's decentralized. We don't know where it is. There's nowhere to go. And so if you can't find the key, which I've had that occur once or twice now in my practice, it's forever lost. You can't get it unless you find the key at a later date, or you somehow find out the numbers and letters. I mean, that's my understanding, at least.
That's the only way.
Now, just as an overview of tax basis, so you can kind of understand where this is coming from, typically an individual will acquire a basis by cost. And that's the number one way. That means you buy it, what your purchase price is. The others would be as if you inherit it, which would be under, at least in the United States, the fair market value of the asset on the date the person who had it before died and before they gave it to you by their will or trust. You can acquire it by gift, which would be you would take the person who acquired it before, it would be a transferor basis. So whatever basis they had along with their holding period would pass it to you. And then lastly, if you're a minor or you do other things and you receive it as a payment, the income that's recognized to the IRS for that transaction that you report on your 1040, that would be the basis then in the currency. And this is what this says here. And again, it's important that you keep track of these things, because this is what the IRS will look at when you fill out your tax return, when you fill out your 706, if you have an estate tax return, all these things. This is where you tell the IRS, this is how I acquired it, this is the basis, and then based on that, you would have gain or loss. And again, the carrying period or holding period, that determines if it's a long-term or short-term capital gain. Now, there is an exception to the step up or step down rule. If I know Eric is ill and he might die in the next year, and I own all this appreciated cryptocurrency, and I give it to him with the understanding that he'll give it back to me in his will, and I'll receive a step up in basis to fair market value at the date of his death, the IRS says, no, you can't do that, and it will maintain the original basis. So that's the exception to that. You need to be aware of that, because people try to do that kind of stuff. We've talked about the treatment of cryptocurrency, and again, since it's a property, it receives a capital gain treatment. And again, the holding period is very important. Now, here are some basic rules that you might see in your practice. If someone trades a cryptocurrency for US dollars, that's going to be a taxable event. If you're the one who's exchanging the Bitcoin for US dollars. So if I own some and I go to the exchange, or it's peer-to-peer, and I sell it, the income I receive back, that's my amount realized, and then I have to show the IRS the tax basis of the asset when I first acquired it, however I did, and then if there's any appreciation, I'm going to pay tax on the gain, depending on how long I've held the asset, as a capital gain or loss. Or if it's gone down in value, it's going to be a loss. If I exchange it for goods and services, no matter what it is, it's going to be taxable for the fair market value of that good or service when I make the exchange. If I give it as a gift, it's not taxable, at least from income taxes. From the perspective of the gift tax, that's different, and there are rules with that. You get an annual exclusion of $15,000 per year per individual. However, if it exceeds that, then you would need to file a gift tax return and allocate any credit. Right now, it's 11.58 million per individual, so I'd adopt that being a state tax or a gift tax at that time, but you need to be aware of that. But from an income tax perspective, there's no taxation on a gift on the income side. A wallet-to-wallet transfer, if you own it, you go from one wallet to the other, that's not taxable because you still own the asset. And then when you initially buy the cryptocurrency with US dollars, that's not taxable to the person that buys it because you already have US dollars. You're just acquiring an asset. So here are some examples of dispositions. One is the sale for US dollars, or it can be, I guess, euros if you wanted to. Any other currency, that's going to be taxable if you're a US resident. An exchange of value. So if I pay Eric Bitcoin for being my attorney, that's a barter and it's going to be taxable. So whatever the fair market value is of the services he provides me, that's what I would recognize as the holder of cryptocurrency on my tax return. And then if you exchange it for the other, so if I have Bitcoin and Eric has Ripple and we decide to exchange it, the exchange for both of us is going to be taxable because there's no like-kind exchange for that type of asset. Now, from the perspective of compliance, there's been some updates and some things that you need to be aware of. 1099-K reporting relates to if you're a third party that it receives payments, like a settlement organization of some sort, you have a reporting requirement to the IRS. If you have more than 200 transactions and more than $20,000 in value in a year, you have to report to the IRS the taxpayer identification number, names and addresses of the individuals who use your platform. And if you fail to do so, you as the third party are fined. And you don't want to get into that. There was a case on that, shavers. We'll talk about that if we have some time later. There might potentially be differing treatment if you're just an investor, if you're a dealer or a trader. And again, that goes back to the amounts you're exchanging and the types of platforms you are utilizing. Just need to be aware of that. And then, from the perspective of the IRS, what's a security, what's a commodity? We know what they are as relates to things like oil and gas or a stock or bond, but as it relates to cryptocurrency, we're not sure, and we really haven't received enough guidance yet from the IRS to determine if these things apply. We do know that if you're going to do an ICO based on the nature of the asset, that they are going to require you probably to file forms and do what is required as if you're going to offer stock on an IPO. But otherwise, it seems that the government's taken the position that they won't allow preferable treatment as a security or commodity as it relates to actual losses in an exchange between individuals. Now, in SEC v. Shavers, he decided he was going to, he was arrested, I believe, or at least fined for having Bitcoin. And I think he had an exchange, Eric. That's my understanding of what he did.
He had Bitcoin investments, and they were denominated in Bitcoin, and the SEC treated those as investment contracts. And so he was actually, as the owner of these investment contracts, found to have that as subject to SEC regulation.
And then from the, and the other issue behind that is how it's treated from tax perspective. Now, by having it, in that way, it's a treatment of gain or loss. How it's reported, is it ordinary or is it capital? And that can make a huge difference on a person's tax return depending on how many capital gains or losses they have in a year as opposed to ordinary income treatment.
Sure.
Now, we do have an update about how the IRS will treat the individual who has a bunch of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency in their wallet. Because it's property, the idea is you're supposed to identify every Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency when you acquire it and know how much you bought it for, the date you bought it on, and how much it's worth. But if it's all in one wallet and you decide to exchange it, you just pick one out. How do you make the determination which one that went out of the wallet? I mean, very few individuals would have a wallet for every single time they bought a piece of, cryptocurrency. So there was a discussion before, would it be last in, last out, first in, first out? Well, the IRS has given us some guidance in their notices now. And basically, if the taxpayer can pick the Bitcoin or whatever, as long as they can identify it, they know when it was purchased, how much it was for, you can select it for whatever best benefits you, which is great, because before we were unsure of that. But if you can't prove that it's from that, and this is how much I bought it for, and this is the date, and this is the one that I actually used, then the IRS says you must use a first in, first out accounting method. So you need to be aware of that. That's what we now know, which is great. Makes it easier now, but again, there are still a lot of record-keeping requirements on the taxpayer to substantiate what they end up doing.
I think we talked about some of the potential risks throughout our seminar today, but just as a recap of those, obviously any wallets that are secured on the internet, you're subject to cybersecurity risks. If you have the information stored in your head and you you pass away or you forget that information, that's lost forever. Keys can be lost unless you have some mechanism for you to personally track down that information. There's also issues with volatility in the limited market for cryptocurrencies. Although they've gained a lot of popularity over recent years, we still don't see a lot of businesses that accept cryptocurrencies, including professional services. Part of that is because I think, as Brian's explained, the IRS has made it so difficult to transact business in cryptocurrencies and to track those transactions that it's gotten to be, even from a perspective as someone who deals with clients using this technology and using cryptocurrencies, we as a law firm are reluctant to take cryptocurrencies payment because of the unanswered questions about not only tax treatment but some other questions with respect to the volatility of the currency, uncertain regulatory environment, and then manipulation. And we'll talk about that if we flip to the next slide. Although cryptocurrencies are generally considered secure because blockchains don't get hacked, there have been instances where there has been, in the Ether circumstance, it was a hole essentially in the code with the DAO where somebody made off with something to the effect of about $50 million, and they realized there was an error in the software coding. Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, that created essentially it was a fork, and so that's what this is both referring to, forks with Ether and Ethereum Classic and Bitcoin Cash. With Bitcoin, once Bitcoin gained popularity, the network started getting clogged because each particular block in the chain couldn't hold enough data. And so developers decided to expand that. And so they forked the blockchain. So they stopped at one point. They started a new chain going in another direction with larger blocks that could hold more data. But there was pushback against that would force out the smaller players and the smaller miners. So both chains continued, and now you have what's known as a fork. All of a sudden, people who had some Bitcoin now have some amount of Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. go back and see the slide on a double spend problem. Now we've created two currencies out of thin air. Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, the issue there with the DAO is once that hack was discovered, once it was realized that there was a hole in the software code, traditionalists said, well, that's just part of the deal, and that's what we all agreed to when we put our money into this network or this organization, and so too bad, live with it. Other folks said, well, we know that it was a problem. We can actually control that blockchain. We can go back and we can change that. We can go back to where we know that the error occurred and then branch off and go in a new direction. So now you ended up with two different types of Ether, Ethereum Classic and the regular Ethereum. And so I put here, go see slide 6, because that's where we talked about how currencies wouldn't be manipulated, if they were fair, etc. And yet you see the folks who control some of these taking a different approach depending on the convenience of the situation. I also mentioned earlier that Bitcoin transactions couldn't be easily tracked, but they can be tracked because you can see the numbers in the Bitcoin blockchain. And so for cyber ransom payments and so forth, if you want to try and track those transactions, it's theoretically possible. The counter to that is Bitcoin mixers, where everybody's Bitcoin numbers go into one big mixer and then people get a new identity coming out of it. And so again, it's just like everything in the cyber world. There's a point counterpoint to all the security mechanisms. Cyber ransom, I talked about that earlier. That's where somebody locks up. Typically what happens is your data gets locked up, computers get frozen, encrypted, or something happens. Somebody hacks into your system and they say send Bitcoin to this particular address, and until you do, we're not going to release your data. There are different theories on whether or not you should comply with cyber ransom. I mean, it could happen to you again. There's some strategies in negotiating those. So if you know somebody that happens to, or if you have that incident come up, contact us and we'll talk about it some more.
I also want to think one thing here. There was a question for a while how to treat a fork if it occurred with a cryptocurrency, and now the IRS has given us guidance on that type of transaction, and that can be found in Revenue Ruling 2019-24.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with us today, and for